You can learn more. And we are also now recording. Hello, everybody. Once again, my name is Julia Scott, and you're going to be your host for tonight, this evening, for the BRJA 13th of the month, October event. We welcome you to our lovely Zoom space where we hope you're ready to talk and learn and ask questions and push yourself to imagine a better world. So we can start with our usual slide presentation. So this month's event, we're about to get started in a bit. I try to tell people we are going to have a panel. There is going to be kind of a discussion between the panel. If you have any questions or comments, you are free, of course, to use the chat, but I also like to tell people to have paper and pen ready in case we do some journaling. We're not doing that today, or you want to take notes or write down questions. So please have that prepared. Next slide. Just some virtual housekeeping. We want to hear your voice. That is why we have these monthly events. We want to have dialogue and ask questions. So please make sure you can certainly use the chat box. When it's time for question and answer, you are free to ask those questions or make comments. As I mentioned before, we are filming and we are going to have a panel. We're going to be discussing a lot of things. So we'll try to make sure to minimize your audio for the background for that. And so would love to see your lovely faces. But if you do not feel comfortable, please do not feel obliged to do that. So next slide. And we see this space as a learning community. We're really happy to have you here. And so what we mean by learning community is that we're going to be talking about topics, obviously, racism, oppression, and how they intersect with other marginalized identities and pretty recent kind of, current events. And so we assume that you all are here because you want to take part in that work. So making sure that you are asking the questions, making comments, pushing yourself. We have some resources at the end of this event. So all of those things, we're all here to learn. So just making sure that you recognize what this space is actually for. Oh, I see the questions. Okay. Last month, we did an awesome event for our September. You can use this QR code. You can put up your phone to the QR code, and you can actually go into our YouTube and look at it. But we did an event on underreported news. This was our second part of this. And I'm also seeing stuff in the chat with Dana. If you have any questions about past events, they are on our YouTube. So make sure you go and subscribe. And then, go watch all of our videos and leave really awesome, nice comments on the videos. That would be greatly appreciated. And then today's event is titled Disability So White, Exploring the Intersections of Race and Disability. Just so you know, just like all of our other events, this will be on our YouTube channel after we have done editing and put the video up. Okay, and then for next month, like obviously our events are the 13th. So Sunday, November 13th, time to be determined. We're going to be doing an event called Talking About Racism and Anti-Blackness with My Family. As you know, the holidays are upon us. And so that is usually a time, hopefully, for some of us, really good food and laughs, but also sometimes very difficult dialogue. So make sure you come and join this event as we kind of talk through what does that actually look like in practice, and maybe going over some tips and that can help you actually talk with your family about these topics. And let's get a little bit about BRJA. So we were founded in 2003, and we have our roots in the Agents of Change workshops that begin in 1996. We are a program of Fusion Partnerships Incorporated, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And the work that we do these free open public resource events like the 13th of the month, or we do short take videos that's on our YouTube and also our Instagram page, where we talk about, either current events. Like we did a whole discussion on Jeffrey Dahmer and like the whole discussion and like about, was it okay to make that show, that kind of thing. But we also do events like, talking about food waste and like the relationship between racism and our food that we eat, talking about environmental racism. So all of those things can be found on our YouTube. Next slide. And we also, outside of our actual monthly events, we do offer consulting, executive coaching, assessment, and workshops around anti-racism, anti-oppression, organizational development. If you want to learn more about those opportunities, please go to bemoreantiracist.org. And we are on social media. I have mentioned a million times at this point our wonderful YouTube channel. We're also on Facebook, so make sure you go there to see our events. And we are also on Twitter at bemoreantiracist, as well as on Instagram. And as I mentioned, we put some things there for like publicizing our events, as well as we do short take videos and conversations. And if you would love to support this work, you can become a monthly sustainer. If this kind of work, anti-racism, anti-oppression work is important to you, this work is hard work and it's necessary work, especially in our country today. These are ways you can donate. You can, of course, use the QR code to donate, or you can go to bemoreantiracist.org/donate. You have PayPal, you can use your credit card, whatever the case may be, and you can become a monthly sustainer. So you'll be donating once a month. And we also accept one-time donations. So if the monthly thing is not your bag, you can certainly do this for a one-time thing and donate so our work can continue. And make sure you enter a 13th of the month so we know what made you or why you were donating. And after that wonderful explanation of everything, I welcome you to our actual topic of today, Disability So White, exploring the intersections of race and disability. So let's go to our next slide and we can get started. So today, I just went over the welcome and I did our overview. I want to get into like why we're here. So we're going to go over some event background. We're going to do our wonderful panel introductions, and then we're going to have an actual panel discussion where we go into some topics and some questions that hopefully bring up some thoughts or ideas or things for you, the audience. From there, we'll do the audience questions, and then we'll be closing out. So short and sweet and to the point. And I'm really excited to talk today with some of these lovely people. So why are we talking about disability? Well, I'm not sure if folks know, but October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So we are certainly on brand for that. But I think that for a very long time, and I can count myself in this space, disability is not something that a lot of us think about unless you are personally impacted by it or you have someone in your family that is, has a disability. And a lot of the time, for a very long time, disability was dealt with kind of an out of sight, out of mind situation. So if we didn't see it, it's not there. And so what we're seeing now, especially with COVID, disability and disability justice is continuing to be a part of the conversation, as it should. And we also know that because it is a part of people's identities, it's a marginalized situation. When you start looking at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and then having a disability or being disabled, things can be very difficult for you. And so we want to kind of get into why that is and what we can do. So we know that folks of color or those who are from different socioeconomic backgrounds have a higher or increased rate of disenfranchisement and marginalization. And we know that that is because there's a lack of an intersectional focus when discussing this topic. And like I mentioned before, the pandemic, if you have had COVID or you know someone who has had COVID, the discussions of long COVID are continuing to increase. And so that is only going to put a lot more strain, I think, on those who are doing work in disability justice or working with this disability community. And so that is going to be something that we need to be a lot more aware of as we, I think, are learning how to support folks who are just becoming a part of the community or even those who have long been a part of it. And I think it's also just important to remember that disability impacts all of us. It is one of the things that, while we may not think about it, more than likely, like I said, either someone in our family, but us personally, can be impacted at any time. And the more information we have and the more comfortable we are talking about it, hopefully that is not necessarily, it's already a very difficult thing to kind of get into, but we can lessen that, and we can lessen the stigma of having a disability. So we're hoping to cover some of those things today and talk more about how we can be more supportive, how we can be less ableist, and how we can support people who are not only in the community, but those who are doing the work and learning from them. So my next slide. So we have a wonderful panel today. We have Dr. Samantha Fold, and we have Mary Jalil Lanier, who we also call MJ. And we have Gail Betts and Samuela. You know what's so funny? I'm so sorry. Got the first name. I did not know how to pronounce your last name. Can you say it for me, please?
Yeah, it's Ansa.
Ansa. That's what I was reading it as, but I wanted to make sure I was correct. So thank you so much to our lovely panel members for being here. We're really excited to speak with them. But before we get into the panel, I want to do some stats and just some kind of grounding in history about disability. So one of the first things you might be saying, or you might think, is, well, in the United States, we have the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, which is very true. However, it is not necessarily applied everywhere the way we think it is. And I wanted to make sure we had some understanding of that. So this is a timeline of how long that it took and where we are now when it comes to ADA and how this actually impacts our country. You can go to the next slide. So what is it exactly? The American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in several areas, including employment, transportation, public accommodations, communications, and access to state and local government programs and services. Based on that definition, that seems like it covers just about everything someone could need. However, we know that it is not true. And so I wanted to make sure we started here, just so we know what the ADA actually covers, but also this is actually informing how we discuss and support those with disabilities in our country. You can go to the next slide. And what do we mean by disability? I know we all, I'm sure, have our own definitions, but disability is a condition of the body or mind, so an impairment that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. That means that this can range on a bunch of things. There's a whole spectrum of where people fall on disability. Our next slide, please. And so types of disabilities can affect a person's vision, movement, thinking, remembering, learning, communicating, hearing, mental health, and social relationships. So every single thing that we do to live and kind of get on in this wonderful world can be impacted if you have a disability. And that is part of the reason why more of us should be learning about it, more of us should be discussing it. Next slide. And here are some disability stats. So this comes from the CDC's Disability Impacts Us All, impacts all of us. So as you can see here, the percentage of adults with functional disability types, this is what our country is right now, right? So we have 13.7 for mobility, 6.8 for being able to independent living, 5.9% for hearing, vision, 4.6, 3.7 for self-care. And all of these things, if you think about your life on a daily basis, the way we get around, when we go to the movies, when we are going to look for a parking space, all of these things might seem easy to you. However, for those who do have a disability, it can be very difficult. And I know that it might seem that the world is built to support everyone, but we know that it is not. based on the people who actually have to live in it, who have a disability. And so we should be listening and centering them in these conversations. So for our next slide, it just kind of goes off, 26% of adults have some type of disability. 61 million adults in the United States live with one, and the highest percentage lives in the South. And I see Barbara is yes, especially our invisible disabilities. When we're talking about it, we usually do talk about the ones that we see. So let's get started with the panel. I'm going to open this question up to everyone. How do you define disability and how do you define ableism? It's certainly a topic that we see a lot more of coming up now, but for some people, they might have a different idea or definition around it. So I'm going to throw that to the panel. Who wants to go first? Now everybody quiet? Okay.
I'm happy to go first.
Awesome.
Hi, y'all. I'm Samantha Fold. I am a clinical assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and a clinical social worker. And my area of social work is neurodiversity affirming care. And what that really means is just how, as social workers and in training social workers, we ensure that we are breaking down ableism and supporting the various different ways of cognitive and intellectual and neurological being that really should represent what we consider part of the normal spectrum of human diversity, and especially in schools and in jobs and just in the world. Often we don't. We have kind of a very limited and narrow sense of what it means to kind of function and how we should think and how our brain should relate to the world. So that's a little bit about me. How do I define disability and ableism? I define disability as something that is physical, neurological, or cognitive that makes life more challenging. But because of the way society, or really those in power in society, have constructed the physical and social environment and what has been defined as normal. So I very much see disability as situated within social norms and not within the person themselves. And I think disability is usually connected to ableism, meaning that I view ableism as kind of an assumption that there is either one way or a relatively narrow norm of how we think someone should operate that fails to recognize physical and or neurological diversity and different ways of being, processing, or moving in the world. And it all ties back to, and part of the topic of this panel is many of these norms, and even the way in which our physical structures are built, the way in which we are expected to think and be and behave, is all connected to colonialism and white supremacy. And so it is, I feel it's deeply, deeply tied and interrelated with race and the racism we experience in society.
Yes, absolutely. I like that, the narrow norm, right? Okay. Anybody else want to share their point of view?
I'm not going to share, but thanks, Dr. Folk, for that amazing definition and explanation of both of those words. And that's why I don't feel the need to share, because there's nothing that I disagree with or would add to what Dr. Folk just shared.
Okay. So we think that the Dr. Folk pretty much just did what needed to be done. Okay. So one of the reasons why we wanted to have this event is because not just about, of course, like the month of October, like, the focus, but because we know we don't really always understand it. So how does disability or ableism show up in your personal and or professional life?
I'll jump in on this one. So my name is Gail Betts. I'm a librarian at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. and I work with the School of Social Work. I myself have a visual disability. I'm legally blind. And so I spend a lot of time working with print materials, books, things like that, which makes it a little bit more interesting. But recently, as somebody who doesn't drive, the infrastructure that we have set up in Baltimore City and in America in general really makes cars a lot more of a necessity. And so personally, it means that, you know, running errands, going to the grocery store, doing just like regular weekend or weeknight related things takes a lot longer and requires a lot more logistics, especially as it's starting to get darker earlier. I have a lot less time at night to get things done safely without a car. And professionally, this has been, as somebody who commutes to campus, not driving makes it a lot more interesting getting to and from work. And so I'm a lot more reliant on what's the weather, how are the public transit systems working today, as well as the shift from fully virtual back to being on campus hybrid, back to being on campus fully, et cetera. Just that public transportation or transportation commuting problem has led to a lot of conversations around, well, if it's hard for me to get to work, that doesn't mean that I'm not social or that I'm not a team player, and the implications of this one small thing of not driving saying so much more about how I interact with other folks and what's considered normal and acceptable.
Thank you for sharing that. So, like, I think one of the things that I'm definitely hearing is not only just like the system is not set up, because we have public transportation. We're going to talk a little bit more about Baltimore with this example, because I too take public transport, and Baltimore's transportation system, that's a whole other event. It's a whole other 13th event. But there's a lack of it. Does not run the way it's supposed to run. It is not necessarily the most accessible thing for people. I mean, as we know, that transportation is a civil rights issue, right? Like, we already have that issue, and then when you have a further marginalization, makes it that much harder to actually use. But then also people make assumptions based off of these things too. So it's not just about like, oh, I have to depend on this to buy groceries or go places, but also people are now saying like, oh, well, Gail's not too social because, you know, she doesn't do this, or we don't see her the same way we see everyone else. So there's a very narrow view or an account of like why that may be. And that I'm sure does not make it any easier. Did anyone else want to add about their personal or professional, about how it's impacted?
I can talk a little bit about my work. This is Sammy. I am the voting rights advocate at Disability Rights Maryland. We're the state protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities. So we're federally mandated to ensure that people in Maryland with disabilities are being treated fairly and not being deprived of their rights and civil liberties. I guess I could talk like more in line with like voting and like elections and things that I see there. But one way I see like ableism show up a lot is like some of the precautions. I mean, some of the accommodations that were allowed during COVID are now not being allowed. And that's really impacting a lot of the ways that people with disabilities can participate in our electoral process. So during COVID, people could sign ballot petitions electronically. So, you know, you have to get at least, I think, 10,000 signatures for a ballot to be approved, ballot petitions to be approved to be on the ballot. And people with disabilities can't sign sometimes, or just COVID precautions, so you don't want to be in somebody's space. So they allowed electronic signatures during the state of emergency, but now that the state of emergency is over, they're not allowing that anymore. And Another way I see it show up is in the ballot marking devices. So they're really for anybody to use, and I encourage everyone to use them. But ballot marking devices have a range of like accessible features. If you cannot sign or use a physical ballot that you write with your hand. But the issue with that is the ballot prints off a different way than a physical ballot looks like, and everyone is entitled to a secret and a private ballot, but you can tell, well, you can't tell exactly who voted at a BMD, but because their ballot is different, you can tell somebody used the BMD versus a physical, a handwritten ballot. So people's vote are not secret anymore in that way. So that's something that, you know, we're working on, and just designing elections and election paperwork, and even like the State Board of Elections website, the local boards, how accessible are those, and things like that. I think ableism really presents itself in how I think people see accommodations or like hear about accommodations and be like, oh, like, why would you need that? That sounds like somebody who's that would be lazy, or why would somebody need that, and stuff like that. People aren't thinking that people actually really need accommodations and things like that. And just like the stigma against certain things being used that seem easy, or not a privilege, but like, you know what I'm trying to say, stuff like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I thank you for that, because one of the things that I've certainly seen in the last few years are those kind of older commercials for those gadgets that you would see, and it's like, oh, I can't open up this, you know, this bottle, so like I need this gadget. And it's like, I mean, I think a lot of people would see that and be like, that is ridiculous. Why would someone need that? But that technically a lot of the time those things are used as accommodations for folks who might have a disability. And now it's like, oh, well, that isn't, okay, I never thought about it. And I think it's interesting that that is something that we don't always think about when it comes to voting, because the assumption is like, okay, well, there's some setup for this. We have the ADA, and voting is a part of, you know, our culture. We encourage people to do that, but we're not making it easier for folks who don't have a disability. So the fact that folks who do, like, where does that leave them? If it's not easy for someone who doesn't have a disability, where does it leave those that do? And if they're not being able to make their voice heard, especially in elections that impact them increasingly, that is going to be a problem. And, you know, like I said, with COVID has been a very interesting thing to witness, because a lot of the time we have all of these kind of rules and stipulations of things that were not allowed. Like, oh, well, you can't work from home. You can't do this. You know, like, if you want to get this, you have to be in person. You got to sign this. And what we're seeing is that the world can run when the opposite, like when we make other rules possible. So yes, work from home. What does that look like? Let's think about it. They didn't say, okay, well, you're just off for a year. Like, I was working from home. So how can we make sure that we are making, you know, I think accommodations that benefit not just those with disability. That's the funny thing, that it's like a lot of the time when we're a lot more intentional, I think, in our approach, and a lot more inclusive in our approach, we actually end up like helping a lot more people, even those who don't have a disability. So that is something we should definitely be thinking more about. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about your work, Samuel. I know that you are doing a lot of stuff with Disability Rights Maryland. Did anybody else want to share, MJ? I see you're not muted, so I'm gonna assume.
Yep. Everybody, Mary J. Lil for long, MJ for short. I am a Black person, woman identified, and I also have invisible disabilities. It's interesting because I think one way that ableism has shown up in my life is I was diagnosed with dyslexia in the 3rd grade, and one thing that they were always really adamant about was dyslexia not being a disability. And it's like, but why can't it be? And why are we making that argument, right? I'm also a graduate of the School of Social Work at University of Maryland, so my MSW by trade. And I actually like send emails for a living. So it's kind of ironic that I am dyslexic and had IEP to 504 and all of that jazz. And another way that I see ableism and disability showing up in my personal life is I didn't stop having ADHD or being dyslexic because I got older. So to think about, like, in grade school, you get accommodations at, there's also all like different types of accommodations for people that have physical disabilities, but they're like millions of Americans who can't, millions of adults who cannot read. And how are we thinking about our websites? I personally, sure, I can read, but I read really slow, and I'm so smart that I want it to go faster. So I like to listen to things as opposed to reading them. And some websites, you cannot select all in speech to text. Some computers are better at speech to text than others. Sometimes Microsoft Office just decides that read aloud is not going to work on your computer ever, no matter what anybody does. So figure it out. And these are the little things that we like, unless you need to use them, you don't think about them as a thing. And I think that over time, finding out like what things were accessible to me to assist me in life, it always felt like I had to grow out of dyslexia to be able to succeed in academia or in work that wasn't tangible with my hands. But even in work that you do with your hands, you still have to read the instructions. You still have to comprehend and process the things. And it's like, how are workplaces thinking about that as a reality? Yeah, those are some of the main ways it shows up. And then I think for myself, I'm also diagnosed with autism. So, and as a Black person, one Black and a woman, it just went under the table. Like no one thought about the ways that my social abnormalities were showing up as autistic. No one thought to say that until really it took me going into social work, going into sociology, going into the field to learn like, oh shit, sorry for cussing, but I guess we're adults. Like, I think these things are me. So these things that we talk about missing, I got missed. Even as it relates to literally, I work with kids before going into social work school. And throughout grade school, I always related to people with disabilities in a way that was like, well, I feel like you and you clearly feel like me because you don't talk to everybody, but you're talking to me. And I understand you in the way that other people don't. Why might that be? And I think it just was kind of ignored. So that's kind of one of the ways that the cross section, like even though I was very engaged in like tutoring and went to summer camp for kids with learning disabilities and had the IEP and I had the 504 and I got accommodations, there was no one kind of connecting these dots that I'd connected for myself, or later learned that dots don't really get connected for a lot of people. So take that into my practice and appreciate meeting people like Samantha and Gail at the School of Social Work, which just happens to be where I also went, who are focusing on the fact that this is not happening and trying to get other people to see it, like to do the work themselves also. So it's been interesting to kind of be an advocate before I recognized that I was a person with disabilities and was able to self-identify in that way. Advocacy is a thing that I'm interested in and do. So to combine the two and to see how ableist I am myself, how much I do not think about disability, how much I do think about it more than other people because it's been a part of my life the whole time. Because even before I was diagnosed with disabilities, my mom worked at the Bear School, which is actually one of Baltimore City's public schools for people with cognitive, developmental, and physical disabilities. So I've been engaged with people with disabilities since I was 3 years old in a very personal way. Yeah, those are some of the ways that they show up and disability and ableism show up in my life. And every day, it's all the things.
I mean, like, here's the thing, though. I think that's interesting. You mentioned kind of like the connecting of the dots, right? Like that even when you connect the dots, like you think there's gonna be like an aha, like well, we found it. Like it's kind of that movie moment, but like even then, because of stigma, because of people not knowing or understanding, because of lack of resources, even when the dots are connected, it's like there's still another dot to connect to. And I can't do that because there's so much going on. So absolutely, I think that that was a really good kind of explanation of how this actually can look on the ground. Another thing that I really thought about, and Gail and I have had conversations in the past, mainly about how our country and how our world is structured. So when she was talking about, like, oh, well, transportation is like, our city is set up for cars, right? And so because our city is set up for cars, the assumption is that everyone is going to have a car, and everyone is going to, drive everywhere. Even though we know that like transportation is a really important thing, not just for people who don't have cars, but how about if you actually cannot drive? Like there are rules and regulations about who can and cannot drive. So it would behoove us to have transportation that is, good, and at least can get people where they need to go. But that ends up kind of falling to the wayside. It's like, and so that's a bigger kind of, I think, discussion about how we even build our world, how we build our communities. And it tells us who we want in those communities, who we think it's worth being in those communities. And usually, that is a huge thing. So thank you for sharing some of that information. Before we kind of get into like the intersectional conversation a little bit more deeply, I did want to get just an idea about how did you all get into the work? I know that some folks obviously have disability, and so they're like, oh, this is what kind of my introduction was. But how did you actually get into this work? And also not listed, what do you see some of like the challenges being in this work as you're doing it?
I'll go first. So one, I personally want the world to be a better place for everybody in the world. And I think in order to create a more equitable world, we have to identify people who are being affected the most and in all of the ways that they're being affected. So that was kind of how like disability becomes a thing that I care about. To be honest, kind of started with racism, but like I said, disability has always been a part of my life. So it wasn't necessarily a afterthought, but it was definitely not a forward. It wasn't a forward facing thought. And I think kind of focusing in on disability more happened in graduate school when I got more engaged in like social clubs and whatnot. And I was a part of the African American club, part of the queer club, a part of the people doing work club. And then I have these friends who have disabilities and they were literally trying to start a group for people with disabilities. And it was like, oh wow, this doesn't even exist at this school that is 60 years old, where this group is 25 years old and this group is 10 years old and this group is as old as the school. This space, when this is a safe space, an accessible space, a place that's trying to create equity, that we have to create and fight for this space for ourselves. They didn't create it for us. So that's how it became something that was like, oh, I should really do this. And also the dyslexia and the ADHD just didn't go nowhere. And it was like, I really want to do this academic thing, but literally y'all gonna say I'm lazy. And I'm just like, I'm also from Baltimore, so things like, and I'm slow, right? Like how can I be a part of that not being what the case is? And how can I get to know more? That's what got me engaged in the work, like disability work specifically.
Thank you, MJ. Other folks?
I can go. So before I joined DRM, I guess in college, I guess since I was young, like, I don't know, I really cared about fairness and equity and making sure everyone is included. Just, things, people are, done right by, I hope that makes sense, but that people are doing right by other people, especially people that I realize don't get done well by larger society. And I feel like the government is accountable to us, and I'm very serious about that. And we have to check up on them, make sure that they're doing right. So that's always been like kind of my shtick since I was a kid. But in college, I majored in justice and law, so more like criminal justice, but a lot of like policing and like accountability and stuff like that. More criminal justice side of like civil liberties and civil rights. And then while I was in college, I was the vice president of our chapter of Black Girls Vote and the political action committee chair for our chapter for our NAACP chapter. So that was like also my civil rights and voting type of I guess, my niche there. And then after I graduated, that summer I got a fellowship with the mayor's office of equity and civil rights on the Mayor's Commission with Disabilities. And that was really my first time like really exploring disabilities in terms of like civil rights and things like that. And that was a good experience and kind of like my first dip into the disability world. So it was like a good surface level understanding. And then I realized like how many gaps were in that, and also just my own knowledge. Like that wasn't an area I had seen before. So that intrigued me. And then I found a advocacy position where I am right now related to voting, and I was offered that. So I took it, and it's been about a year now since I started, and it's just really accelerating my learning of disabilities and connections to like larger civil rights, and being able to notice the gaps a little bit in the disability community and space, and like how I can fill that. So it's a little bit about me.
Thank you. I also think that it's cool that you were like, I did this in college with Black Girls Vote, and then this happened. Those kind of stories always make me very happy, because I certainly remember my own experience in getting to the work that I do now. A lot of the time, like I learned a lot about myself in different communities in college. And so that is a really awesome thing. Thank you for sharing that. So we got 2 more folks left before we continue our conversation, and then we're gonna open it up for questions. And I see there's a lot of stuff in the chat going on. I don't know what's even going on there. Did anybody else want to answer that question, or we can move to the next one?
Sure. I just wanted to piggyback on what Sammy is saying, because I work with her.
Oh, okay.
Robin Murphy from Disability Rights Maryland, and I can probably give you a little perspective from the old folk. So I became aware of this, both the civil rights movement for people of color and the disability rights movement when I was in high school, which really dates me. But the P&A, which is the office we're at now, Disability Rights Maryland, it's part of a national network that was started in the late 70s. And when I went to law school, I started working at the P&A in Connecticut. And what strikes me is really evidence of the need for continued activism in this area is that we were created, the P&As, in response to some horrendous abuse and neglect of people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and mental disabilities in institutions where basically people were warehoused. And disproportionately people of color were warehoused in these institutions. And part of the mandate of the P&A is to protect and advocate for people in institutions. And we have been very fortunate as a network to shut down a lot of the large institutions. But what strikes me is there is so much still to do 40 years later. And we are clearly not funded. We are funded by Congress in many different ways, clearly not funded enough to even hit all the basic problems we need. We do transportation, we go into institutions, we go into prisons. We're looking at PG County and a lot of the disproportionate discipline of students, both students with disabilities, but then if you're a student of color, that the impact is multiplied. And so we look very carefully at that. So it's just an observation. I could really go on and I don't want to.
Listen, yeah, thank you. Your name is Robin. Thank you so much for sharing that. Definitely, if there's any kind of like information you want to share in the chat, please do so. And like when we're doing the audience, I would please welcome you to share more about what you all are doing for the work, particularly in Maryland, because we want to make sure that we're as connected as possible in providing support and resources for people. I want to thank you for answering that question.
Yeah. It really heartens me to see that BRJA is interested in disability issues. So I'd encourage you to look at our website, because we are looking at transportation, we're looking at education, we're looking at prison issues. So, but there's only 40 of us, a small but mighty group.
Listen, you're speaking to the choir here. So absolutely. Thank you so much, Robin. Gail and Samantha, did you all want to talk a little bit and then go, or did you want to go to another question?
Yeah, I know you were unmuting.
No, next question is great.
Okay, so then let's get into the nitty gritty. How do you see race and disability?
Hold on. I'm being petty, but I want to know how Samantha got into the work, because I think she just does really, really cool, important work. So if she was willing to answer it, then I think that's worthwhile thing being on the recording.
I tell Samantha all the time that people speak her praises, but she doesn't like to listen to me in that regard.
Thanks, y'all. Sure, I'm happy to talk about it for a minute. I got into this work, I don't know, in a few ways. It wasn't intentional. I have a younger brother with really complex medical needs and lots of disabilities. And I, during college, was working at a summer camp, like a national high school leadership camp. And they had an inclusion-based program for autistic teens to have a summer camping experience away from home that they might not be able to have otherwise. And especially it wasn't that long ago. This was maybe 15, maybe at this point a little more than 15 years ago. I'm getting older than I care to admit sometimes. But at that point, there just weren't that many programs. And something like inclusion was considered, the idea of inclusion was considered pretty radical, which is horrifying to think about now, and also shows how far we've come.
Yeah.
I think in a short period of time. And so I was working at the summer camp, and they didn't have someone to kind of staff the work with some of these teens and part of the program. And so they approached me about it sort of like, hey, you have a brother with disabilities, come work in this program for autistic teens. And my response to them initially was, no, like, I don't have any experience. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, this would not be fair to them. And they were basically like, well, we need you, so figure it out. And that kind of tracked me into this work, because what I noticed was at that time, inclusion was radical and it was a push. It took a lot of community organizing and conversations and, pushing people to be willing to open up their spaces. And it seemed ridiculous. I mean, at that point, I don't think I knew the term neurodiversity, but it was so clear that that's what, like, everyone brought gifts to the community and they weren't being recognized. And so that's kind of what led me into social work. And I went the clinical route. I learned how to be a therapist. And Julia, to your question, kind of paired along with this about challenges, what I found most challenging as I was working in the mental health world with autistic people and with neurodivergent people and people with intellectual disabilities was trauma. And the estimates are that 85 to 90% of people who are neurodivergent have an additional kind of co-occurring mental health. They will qualify for a diagnosis of a mental health disorder. And what I was kind of seeing in my work was that that's not like a natural thing. It's not just happening, that it was a result really of living and growing up and kind of cumulative trauma of kind of living in an oppressive society and living in a world that wasn't designed to respect neurodiversity, living in an ableist world. And yet all of our treatment frameworks focused on intellectual and developmental disabilities or behavioral. They focus on academic goals. They focus on essentially becoming more normal and kind of meeting benchmarks that are not naturally affirming for that person. And so the invisibility of trauma in people with particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities was something I saw and continue to see as a real challenge in my own work and professional space.
Okay, MJ.
And that's
that actually works really, really well, because I think it helps us, go to that next topic, which is these intersections, which you were essentially bringing up, Samantha, is, how the world itself, and Gail has brought this up, Samuel has brought this up, MJ has brought this up, the world is not built for folks with disabilities, and our understanding of what disabilities are very limited. And the ones that we do talk about, it's like, well, this can be fixed. And we're gonna have you meet these benchmarks. And then it's like, you're like the rest of us. And the reality is, that's not the way that it works. But I really found really impactful, MJ, when you were speaking, of like, oh, well, you're like, I grew up with this and I was an adult. And I was like, something is up, and I'm in class. And I've certainly had that moment in social work school where you're like, oh, this is my life. And you're like, oh, this is about me. What do I even do with this information? How do I get support? And you would think that it would be easier, but it's not. And we just kind of assume, places like academia aren't going to have folks with disabilities. That's not true. And if anything, we actually probably need more people so they can impart more wisdom and help us get the system to work better than it actually is. And that's not just in academia, but that's in our educational spaces, that is in any place that we work in. And so we can kind of lessen that stigma and open up understanding. Hopefully we can get more support. So I had asked really about kind of like the disability, where do you see the intersections on a daily basis? But I think the next question is like, what does it look like in disability spaces also when it comes to race? Because a lot of the time, as we've seen with talking about disability, and I've seen this from folks who are Black or, of color who work in disability spaces, it is usually kind of white. When you look it up on the internet, you have to be very specific. I'll say that. So I have to look up Black people with disabilities or Asian people with disabilities, but most of the time the face of those with disabilities are white people. And so how does that impact the work that we're doing or that you all are doing, and impact how we're helping folks? That question is for anybody.
On a personal level, it's impacted me in a way that was like, to get my diagnoses, I was literally teaching the neuropsychologists that it was possible for autism to show up in the way that it showed up in my life. Because I'm a Black person, I'd say similar. I'm also not straight, right? So I think similar to like not being straight in the Black community is accommodating. And it might not be the most accommodating, and yes, it has its problems, but I think it's like, come on, baby, we got you. We're gonna figure out what you need. We're gonna do it. I think that is how Black people operate. So I would say at home, me not talking, or just some things that might have been identified as abnormal was just accepted, and it was okay. And I actually have a nephew who's on the spectrum, and a niece who are on the spectrum, and it is very funny to try to get and this is right, this is not race in a larger thing, but the fact that we are Black and it's in my Black household, to get them to identify Trinity shouldn't be screaming like that, and shouldn't be, right? Even saying shouldn't be is like, it is something that we might want to look into, the fact that she is doing that, to assist her to figure out why and how to address it. If it's something that needs to be addressed, or if she just need to scream, like if she need to scream, that's okay. And that's how we handling it, but let's figure out why. So I think that is one way that it is showing up, like in two ways, really. One, things just not being able to, because I know to say hello, that means that I'm not socially awkward. but you don't get to not say hello when you got to say hi to everybody in the house. And that's what you're supposed to do when you walk in somebody's house or when you walk in a room. You don't get to not say hello. And because I'm not severely on the spectrum in a way that said, I'm not going to do it anyway. But that's still something to identify. But, and also on the family tip, hey, y'all, this is something that should be checked out. And having to have those conversations with family members and with people in general. With people in general, like had people was in class with like thinking going back in time, like the kid that was running Norwich running down the hallway was on the spectrum. And we never talked about him being on the spectrum. We never talked about him being, him having any disabilities. It's just what was in my Baltimore City public school. But actually, I think he should have done something different because he wasn't in the IEP meetings when they got all of us that had IEPs together. Lewis wasn't in the room. So why is Lewis not in the room if y'all do the adults see this thing? So I think being able to identify disability in Black people is a thing. It's ironic because we're overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, over-institutionalized, underserved. I just said a bunch of things, but I think those are the ways that the intersects have shown up in my reality.
Absolutely. I think that like the interesting thing you brought up is that like you're not listened to. And one of the things that when I was like doing research and coming up with questions and thoughts, a little bit off script, was that a lot of folks who do have disabilities say that once you are diagnosed, or if you haven't, but like if you're starting to think, people think that you like something is wrong with you. They're like, that's not correct. And it's like, no, I am telling you that something is not right. And I think especially if you're talking about those who are neurodivergent, like it's a little bit harder to say like, this is going on when I'm doing this. I see other people doing this. I'm not doing that. And this is not like something's up, that you all of a sudden, you do not know yourself. And therefore you are not listened to. And so when you're adding like things like race, when you're adding things about like your sexuality or your gender identity, that becomes even more like impactful, because if they're not listening to Black people, they're not going to listen to someone who is Black and possibly disabled. That makes it a lot worse for you. So kind of thank you for talking about those intersections, but also how it actually happens in a household, what we should be having discussions on. Did anybody else want to share like their points of view?
Sure, I'm happy to share. Something that really stands out for me in thinking about kind of the intersection of ableism and whiteness and racism is how much stigma exists around disability, and the label of a disability and what it means. You know, people have all sorts of questions about like, well, what's that going to mean for your work? And what's that going to mean for your school? And what's that going to mean for your relationships? And in our country, if you need public services and public funding because of your disability, we have structures that penalize you for getting married. I mean, it's so stigmatized and built into our systems in that way. And so I do think that disability spaces and disability justice spaces have often been heavily white and white focused. In fact, there was a mention in the chat of Crip Camp, the documentary that's on Netflix about the history of the disability rights movement. And it's a fabulous documentary. And one of the criticisms of it has been that almost everyone in that film is white. And why is that? And I think that just my own assessment is one of the reasons is to put yourself out there often and be so vocal and open and kind of challenge the norms of ableism. White privilege really helps. It's so much more of a risk as a person of color. And someone who occupies additional marginalized identities. And so I think that the way that white privilege has shaped the disability rights movement and disability spaces is something that really needs to be examined more, so we can think about ways of uplifting more voices to really kind of name that and address the racism that's happened there.
Absolutely. Yeah. See, they don't call you Dr. Fold for nothing. See, absolutely. I think that go ahead, MJ, go ahead.
To add on to, I like literally started, because agree with Dr. Fold. That's funny, I keep calling you Dr. Fold, but in real life, I've never called you Dr. Fold, always say Samantha. So that's funny. But in college, like the social clubs for people with disabilities on the pictures is one person that's Black. Like it's one person that's Black if there's one person that's Black. So I play rugby, I'm not joining another white club. Okay, let's move on from that. Then that's undergrad, but in graduate school, when I do start to get into advocacy a little heavier in thinking about disability, when I go to like look up people, it's white people that are coming up. So I have to be intentional about finding Black disabled organizers to follow, to know what was going on in the disability community. And what they're all talking about is how racist people are within the community. So disabled people being racist and being colorblind and being really ableist themselves. And that opened my eyes to a bigger world. But like I had to go find these people and follow them, because it was just like, I don't want that academic perspective. I want a perspective that speaks to my lived experience and the people who are marginalized by people who aren't talking about them at all. Yeah, so you gotta find them, sadly. It's like suffering.
I just wanted to say, I agree. I think a lot of the disability space is just now like realizing what intersectionality is and trying to incorporate that a little better. And I think it's a little hard because disability can be so broad, like physical and then invisible disabilities. So it kind of, I feel like that takes up more of their time trying to incorporate all disabilities, and then you break it down by race and things like that. But that's like one of the things that I'm trying to be very intentional about in my work at DRM, about uplifting different voices and experiences within the disability world. And I think also the powers that be, white supremacy, colonialism, all of that, I think they thrive on like separation and like not including everybody into the conversation. And that's how those structures still are able to exploit people and do the bad things that they do. So I think it's just something that we all have to be cognizant about.
Absolutely. I think that what you all have brought up, and it's kind of, I think, I forgot what you call it, a narrow norm. Samantha, just that's what white supremacy does. Like it teaches you, like, this is who you're supposed to be. Like, and if you are somebody who is Black or of color, or you are, Jewish, like you're supposed to be fighting to get to this. And that's why like our benchmarks, that's why our education system is like, though, we just do these things, they'll grow out of it, as opposed to that's not the case. So what do we do about it? And I remember a little bit in our conversation, but this was like sometime last year, Gail, when we were talking about it, like testing, and you were like, yeah, because of course, somebody says, well, I might need accommodations for testing. Cool, fine. But we don't say, hey, maybe everyone just needs actually more time for testing because the testing time is wrong. We say, well, something is wrong with this kid and they need a little bit more support, as opposed to like, I could have used some more time on those tests. Like, I'm not good with testing. It's like, and so I think what it does is that it limits our scope of understanding what is actually needed for people to thrive, because we're only allowing them to thrive with so much in this very limited, narrow normed kind of society. So I think that what you all are talking about is how white supremacy, gives you the blueprint of what they want you to do. And it's like, well, that's not reality. And because it's not reality, what are we going to do about it? And instead it's just like, well, we'll just put them over here. We'll give them some accommodations of the law. There's some videos, and we have a month, and great, as opposed to like, no, what does it actually mean to support people? And that means like expanding a lot of the stuff that we're kind of used to. And I always tell people, you know, that also means that it's a possibility things that you're used to might go away. They're gonna have to shift. And that's good. You're gonna have to figure that out and we will be okay. But that's a part of the I think the system that needs to be changed. I know that we talked a little bit about like disability racism and how it impacts things like voting and employment, education. But considering that a lot of folks who do have disabilities are like increasingly marginalized when it comes to jobs, when it comes to these things, what do you think are some things that we can do to better support that community? Is like not just for them, but I think for all of us.
I can talk about jobs and employment and things like that. So something that I have been working on a lot over the last several years is updating our hiring practices so that, like you just mentioned, Julia, maybe the way we're doing it, instead of accommodating one person, like what if we just change the whole thing for everybody?
Right.
And so advocating for things like sending the interview questions out to candidates in advance. That helps a lot of folks with disabilities for a lot of different reasons, but it also just makes for more prepared candidates across the board. And so we're not testing candidates on, can you come up with the best possible answer off the cuff? That doesn't really matter. We want to know what your best possible answer is so that we can evaluate if you're the right candidate. And so sort of being aware of what could come off as one-off accommodations, but could be broadened out to a larger scope. And something that has been really great in the library recently is having these conversations with people. And so when I'm not on a search committee or I'm not involved in the hiring practice, I have colleagues who are advocating for those changes to say, like, have we sent the questions out in advance and how far in advance? And being able to rely on other people to ask the questions of, have we considered this? So that if I'm not in the room or there's not another disabled person in the room voicing those concerns, I know that there are people who are thinking about it. Has been really lovely as of late, as we've had more of these conversations.
Absolutely. I want to start to open us up also after Samantha to our audience. They can get a few questions in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to tie it into, Gail's point in the employment sphere about how do we make things more universally accessible for everyone? I really do think that is the answer in everything that we do. We're so focused on what do we have to do for you as an individual to accommodate you? And if we shifted that language to what could we do to make things more accessible for you and for everyone else in this community, it really shifts it from an individual to like a social and structural perspective. And I think that when we talk about the intersection of racism and ableism, that's especially important because we know that people of color with disabilities are more likely to get diagnosed incorrectly, diagnosed late, less likely to have access to the healthcare services that you need for the documentation to prove, because you have to make your case to someone that you need these accommodations. And so by creating structures and systems that are more universally accessible for everyone and that offer different paths and different ways of being and different ways of interacting, I think that we are also breaking down the racism that's inherent in that system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to open this up to questions now because so we're going to have some audience questions. I do see there was one from, let me make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Glenna Hayes. Do you find white people with disabilities are not taught about racism because of ableism? So do you find white people with disabilities are not taught about racism because of ableism?
I think, yeah, right. But I think it's more like white supremacy failed both, right?
Mhm.
So more so than it is, well, they're not going to be able to process it. I don't even think it is a thought to think to do anything about it because of white supremacy. And I think maybe some people will say that and think that they're like, they won't see how that's inherently like white supremacist and then ableist, because you're saying that the person is not smart enough to understand a thing that is a social construct. So they probably actually can. And even if they don't, they're experiencing it in the world. So the same way that we can't not teach people how to use the toilet or what toileting, or make sure that there's someone who can assist them with doing that if they cannot, it's like we can't not teach people that racism exists, because it does. And like, I think it's really great to think about, we like talk about racism, right? But I think that's the thing, but like anti-Blackness, I think is even more of a problem than like racism in general as it relates to ableism, and like making sure we teach people who have disabilities who are not who are white about how the racism or anti-Blackness might show up in their own lives. It's a really necessary thing, because it shows up because it's a part of our society as a whole.
Right. Yeah. So like essentially white supremacy and racism are kind of foundational to America. So before you were even like diagnosed with a disability, like if you are white, you are white. And so that means a very specific thing in this country. It means a very specific thing in this world. But it means that you are the norm. And so I always kind of think about like marginalization as like kind of like ticked off boxes. So it's like, okay, you're white. And then it's like, oh, so you're not white. Okay, well, I guess we have to go over here. And it's like, you have a disability and you're not straight. And oh, okay. And it's like the more you kind of tick off, the more difficult it is for you to live. The more impacted you are, by the systems that kind of run our lives. And so I think it's really important to remember it's not so much just like a disability discussion. It's like as a whole, as a country, it impacts everything from like who we vote for, who we desire, how we live is all impacted by white supremacy. I mean, I also see a second, go ahead, Mary.
I was about to say, to answer the second part of the question, it has, I think, anti-Blackness and racism gets othered in a way that it isn't, we don't learn about it the same way that we learn about, like you learn about having to eat, you learn about having to drink water, you learn about having to have shelter, but we don't learn about racism as a thing that is fundamental, or anti-Blackness as a thing that's fundamental in the world, right? Not just America, but really the world as a whole, because that's why colonization happens, because anti-Blackness. And how ableism fits into that, I think it has to, basically we have to stop making it a second thought. And it's hard for myself, it's hard for me even. Prime example, I hate all of the construction that's happening in the city right now, making it more accessible for transportation to get places faster. Hate it. Harper Road and North Avenue should not be one-way streets. But literally in this conversation is like, oh shit, I want Gail to be on time for work. I also want Julia to be on time for work, which are two different experiences of needing to utilize public transportation. I need to get over myself, person who drives. So
really good example there.
Yeah, I think it is very important for us not to think of ableism or racism as additional things, but as things that should be a part of what we are teaching, what we do, what we lead, what we think about. Even if we don't know how to bring it up, it's going to be weird for a second. It's going to be difficult, but you have to. And that's one thing that leaders can do. Bring it up because you have to, not because you're woke enough to do it, but you have to do it if we're gonna actually be an equitable society.
Wow. MJ just come up for my job. I love it. I absolutely agree. Does anyone have any other questions from
Yeah.
the audience? Oh,
Not necessarily a question, just an observation. I think
Sure.
Mary, I can't read, it's too little for me, sorry. But the point that was just made is excellent. And I think you're doing exactly what needs to be done by holding these forums and these discussions, is so people can find out about the issues that are affecting people, both because of racism, because of ableism. Like, the more information we have and the more we join forces, the more effective we will be in eliminating these issues. And I know that's something that Sammy feels very passionate about, and we're thrilled to have her at DRM. And very important to really, the intersectionality is important. And so that means that as civil rights people, as ableists, anti-ableists, anti-racists, that we really need to be a force together.
thank you so much, Robin. Were there any other questions or comments?
I did want to just talk a little bit about my one mission that I'm doing right now.
Oh, yes.
In voting, because the elections are coming up. The deadline to register is October 18th, but we have same day voter registration in Maryland. So if you missed that, that's perfectly fine. You can go during early voting, which starts October 27th, and election day, which is November 8th. But right now, a lot of my time has been going to our state hospitals. So our state hospitals have forensic patients, so people who are not criminally responsible or are awaiting evaluation or treatment to be competent to stand trial. But there's a gap. So the state board has a program where they go to institutions where older people, so our assisted living, and do their registration, but they don't do our state hospitals. That's the gap I've been, sorry, that's the gap that I've been filling these past couple weeks, going to the state hospitals and doing voter registration. A lot of the people in our state hospitals are, a lot of them are Black. For example, 83% of all Baltimore City forensic patients are Black. So that's been really important to me. I've been to—
Can you say that number again? The sound went out on my end.
Sorry, 83% of Baltimore City forensic patients are Black. So there's 5 state hospitals in this, well, 5 state hospitals, and it's about 1,100 beds in the system. Because I'm the only one that does our work, and I'm a little bit crunched for time, I've only been able to do about 2 hospitals. So Springfield in Carroll County and Spring Grove, and I think that's Baltimore City, but it's in Catonsville. Not Baltimore City, I think Baltimore County, I'm not sure, but it's in Catonsville. And it's just been a good time just going and talking to patients and offering them the opportunity to register to vote and telling them what's going to be on their ballot. I think that's important for like full inclusion and just, making sure that they feel a part of the community that they're in. And we have great discussions. Some of them are very adamant about not wanting to vote, and then we'll chat and I'll tell them some of the things that are coming up on the ballot, and then they'll end up registering or requesting a mail-in ballot. So that's been exciting. I'm finishing up hopefully before the voter registration deadline, and then we'll think about long-term how to institute a program. So I'm not the only one doing this, and it's more cognizant in people's brains.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, that the fact that you're the only one doing it is a lot. And it is something that I'm hoping we can get more of, considering that this is when we vote all the time, it seems. So I really want to thank you for for sharing that. I think a lot of the time, I will be honest, when we were putting together this panel, I did not even think about voting. I was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, everyone does it. And yes, how do folks with disabilities vote? I think that a lot of the time the voting ballot is actually pretty ridiculous, and they email it out or they mail it out beforehand so people can see. But what happens, if you don't know, or you don't have the access, or you don't have the information. And so I think the work that you're doing is amazing. I'm glad that you're doing it. And we would certainly need more people to get involved. And I guess like one of my last questions before we start to close this up is, what, other than like what was kind of mentioned, what else can we do? Like, because obviously like this can be a two-parter, three-parter, four-parter like event. And we're going to be talking more about disability, I think, with BRJA, and hopefully kind of doing a lot more work around it. But what can we do just in our regular lives to make sure that we are being more inclusive and being more open when discussing or supporting folks in the disability community?
I'm sorry, I'm gonna go first real quick because I have to leave soon. But I just want to say, to be a good advocate, I think honestly just asking like, how does this affect people with disabilities? Like, how would this program, this policy, this event that we're about to have, how are you going to make it accessible and things like that? Even if, and it's perfectly fine. I feel like people are hesitant because they don't know the answers. And I don't consider myself an expert in disability policy or anything like that. But just opening your mouth and highlighting that you're thinking about it, and then getting everyone else in the room to think about it, I think is a great first step, because then I feel like it's like a light bulb that goes off in people's heads that we even mention disability, because most oftentimes it's just not even mentioned at all. And it's fine if you don't know the answers, because once you mention it, then you leave space for somebody who does have the answer, somebody who is disabled, to be in that space or to be invited into that space, to make sure that it is accessible. And if you do, reach out to somebody who is disabled to do some of that work, that you pay them for their time and their work that they do. That's my little speech. I'm gonna leave my contact info in the chat, and with y'all will have that, and we can stay connected and things like that. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Sammy. I appreciate it. I know that you did leave a little bit earlier, but she stayed for a little bit longer, so we appreciate that. Anybody else?
Sure, I'll go because I'm already off mute, and that's why people are pausing.
Yep.
I think Sammy made a great point. Like, you have to, and like I said before, you have to say something. Like, even if you're not comfortable, even if you don't know how does this affect people with disabilities, should be a part of everything that you are planning. And also really get on YouTube, get in the podcast, get more aware of things of disability, of things that are a part of the community of people with disabilities. And let's kind of stop, let's even just make it more of a part of our communities as a whole, and things that we do on the regular basis. Like I said, I've been in really close proximity to people with disabilities my whole life because of my mom. And that is not a normal experience. And that is a problem because there's so many people with disabilities throughout our world. So we have to normalize disability in a way that is not so stigmatized, that people who literally have disabilities are being told, you just have a disorder. And it's like, that's cute, but what's the difference? And yeah, figuring out that there wasn't really a difference was a whole journey for myself. Like, oh wait, they lied to make me feel better, because actually, if it's not a disability, no one's gonna help me. So that's cute that I have a disorder, but so I think we have to do all that we can to destigmatize disability, and to center that really the problem is that there was this able-bodied norm that became that was never the truth. And yeah, kind of decenter what the norm is I think our biggest work. And to take that extra thought to think about, am I thinking about people who aren't like me? Or am I thinking about people who can't walk? Am I thinking about people who can't see? Am I thinking about people who can't hear? Am I thinking about people who think differently? Like, you have to take that extra second to really think about it. And you might be disappointed in yourself because you're not doing it often. I'll be disappointed in myself. And then it's like, but it's okay, because this is the way to do better. So
yeah. Thank you for that, MJ. I appreciate it. Do we feel good closing, or well, what I wanted to say is I have learned a lot from folks on this panel. I have spoken highly of all of you. But I think that, Dr. Fold, I keep calling you Dr. Fold, weird, but Samantha and I have talked about this a lot as well, just that, we know that the way that we do things are not necessarily the only way we can do them. And so part of shifting, part of making this world and society a lot more inclusive is kind of asking those questions, even when they take time. Even when it seems like it's going to take forever. But if we're really about doing the work and making it a lot more inclusive, that means we have to do things that we weren't doing before. And so that is going to be an important part of the work. So I'm going to leave you all with that. I will say our wonderful tech person, Dana, she shared a document with some resources. Some of them were shared from our panel. And also I know that Sammy had put her information in the chat. So if you want to copy that or download the chat itself, before we close up for today, I want to thank you all for coming to the BRJA event. I know that this is just the beginning of conversation around disability and disability justice, but please know that we are dedicated to improving our discussions on this topic and making sure that we are a lot more inclusive and intersectional going forward. So I want to thank MJ and Samantha and Gail for spending time with me. I feel like I see them a lot, or at least talk to them a lot. But seeing me even after work on Zoom, I really appreciate all the work that you do. And I've learned a lot from all of you immensely. And MJ, I mean, at this point, I thought I was going to get rid of MJ at one point. I don't think that's going to happen. But I want to thank you all just for joining us tonight. I hope that you learned something new. I hope you were challenged in some way. And if you want to contact us, let us know. Go ahead. MJ, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, she didn't say this, but I did voter registration drives when I was in school. And it is very easy to become a registered voter. So I'm sure Sammy could use some assistance. So
Absolutely.
if you all are available, it's a 15-30 minute training to be a registered voter. And granted, there are only 5 days left, but if you had availability, I'm sure she could use the assistance. So if you have time to be able to register voters, COVID restrictions have changed in hospitals. So I'm sure if you have time in the next 5 days to assist her with that, she would appreciate the assistance. And it's not registering voters is pretty easy when you'll have this field. So if you have the time, that is a tangible thing that you could possibly do. Help some voters get registered right now.
Absolutely. I want to thank you all once again. You all are awesome, and you all can have a wonderful evening. All right.